Okay, I see we are recording, so let me go ahead and see about sharing my screen. Alright. Welcome, one and all, to the great and powerful intelligent agent. Now, just on a quick note, my name is Douglas Hemphill. I am one of the campus instructional designers and am part of our digital learning environment support team. Our other members are Teresa Gilliard-Cook, Carrie Mocyk, who's my fellow instructional designer, and from the campus technology services side of the house, Kathi Dutton also offers us tremendous support. So that is who we are. Now, today we are going to talk about intelligent agents, and we have a relatively short period of time to do this, so I am going to fly through this. If you have any questions, just shout out, interrupt me. I have no problem with that. So, what is an intelligent agent? Well, based on Brightspace's definition, it is a tool that monitors a course to find information from the course database and take actions based on criteria that you set. What does that functionally mean? Well, it's probably easier to just give some examples. So you can set the system to automatically email users with grades below a certain level. You can generate lists of people that haven't logged in for a certain number of days and get those emailed directly to you. Or you can pull up a report for specific content to see what users have viewed that content. And throughout this, you'll see QR codes and uh, web addresses. These are D2L, which is the maker and owner of Brightspace. These are part of their knowledge base and their community guides. So everything I say you can find at these links in far more detail. Uh, However, before I get into what Brightspace actually calls an intelligent agent, I want to talk about a very specific type of intelligent agent called a replace string. And what this is just a very simple code that you can enter into any content areas and any communication tools, so announcements and emails, to pull information from the database and populate it uniquely for each student. Below you can see one of the most common examples of this, which is simply to personalize things to a student's first name. So for example, rather than just having a welcome message that says, "Hey, welcome to astronomy," you can change that to "Welcome to astronomy, Karen. Welcome to astronomy, Doug. Welcome to astronomy, Carrie." And that will be unique for each individual student. I would say the first name code that you see here is probably the most commonly used one, but you can see a list of all of these strings at the website that is linked. So, apologies. Before we dive into how you set up an intelligent agent, there's just a few things to think about as you're creating them. One, particularly if you're creating a number of intelligent agents, naming conventions are always important. This goes for pretty much everything in Brightspace. Giving naming conventions that make sense to assignments, to content information, to gradebook items that make sense to you really helps you keep things in order. You'll also see there's an option when you create an agent to fill in a description. Again, that's just a way to help you remember what exactly an agent is doing. And it's good to think about what is your use case for an agent? How often do I want it to run? For example, I probably don't want it reminding students every single day that, hey, you haven't re entered the course in 3 days. Hey, you haven't entered the course in 3 days every single day. That might not be the best use of it. You do, depending on the type of agent, have the ability to use those replace strings I just talked about. So if you've got the system automatically sending an email, you can populate it with a replace string. And then generally just sort of going back to the repetition thing, be careful how often you use agents, especially if they get seen on the student side, but also for your own purposes. Consider what information do you really need. This goes a bit back to Carrie's sessions on controlling your chaos, and just make sure you aren't overloading yourself with information just because you can. So how do we create an intelligent agent? Again, everything I'm about to say is available through the Brightspace community and in far more detail than I'm about to show you. So we are going to jump into Brightspace if I can get my Zoom controls out of the way. So within any course, you want to go to Course Tools, Course Admin, and you should see the option for Intelligent Agents. And the first thing I'm going to do is just create a new agent. And I'm going to give this a name. So let's call this low grade agent. I'm going to skip the description for now, but again, they can be useful. The categories, as with most categories in Brightspace, outside of the gradebook, don't matter. This is just a way of organizing things. So again, I can skip this. Now, really important, is my agent turned on? For now, I am going to leave it turned off. Now, scheduling is simply how often do I want this agent to run? Well, based on how I'm going to set it up, I am going to make this a one-time run, which I can set a specific date for. But you see, if I do it hourly, I can repeat it every hour. I can repeat it every day, weekly, etc. This is where some of my points about, well, how often do you really want to do this comes in. Or if I'm just setting it up for ahead of time, I can just leave this at no schedule and change it later. And then as I continue down, well, what do I want this actually to do? In almost all cases, you're going to want to run this for the entire class. There's based on how we use roles, there's not really any reason you would use the second option. And you can see there's some generic ones. When do I want to take action? Well, I don't really feel the need to adjust this for students that haven't been in the course for a month. So I am going to only send this to users that have logged in the last 2 weeks. If somebody's been out of my course for longer than that, it's probably not terribly useful to reach out to them. The release conditions, these just give you more options. So by default, I can say, okay, I want to send this to members of a certain group. There are more detailed ways you can do it, but this is sort of getting into the deeper lore of uh, intelligent agents. So I'm not going to worry about this now. This would be something that if you wanted to create a more detailed release condition, like I want to potentially send an email to people that have completed a checklist. There's a lot of flexibility in here, but we aren't going to touch on it in this session just because we don't have time. So I just have, again, a generic thing. I want this automate to be run for everybody that is on my class list that has logged in the last 14 days. And finally, under actions, I'm going to say, what do I want it to do? I'm sorry, I made a mistake. I do need to use my release conditions. This is what happens when an instructional designer only looks at something every 3 months, as I'm well aware most of you faculty are in that situation. You come back to your course after 3 months and you say, how did I do this? And I slipped up. So actually, I do need to use my release conditions in this case because this is where I set my criteria. So in this case, I'm going to say I want to do something for every student that scored on a quiz. And so I've specifically selected a quiz, and I want every student that scored, let's say, below or equal to a 60% on this quiz. So now what I have done is said, okay, every student on my roster that has logged in within the last 14 days, but got less than a 60% on this quiz, well, I'm going to send them an email. And you see, as soon as I check that send an email box, I get the option to generate an email to them. And I'm just pulling up my own system. And it should automatically generate the fields in here. So you do not have to do anything. This is automatically populated by the agent.
Actually, Doug, I don't think that's true. You need to use one of these, one of the replacements. And specifically, it's initiating user, no, for the two line, I think that's, if you click on the what special email addresses can I use, it will have it. And it should be initiating user in curly braces.
Okay. Thank you, John.
And the common practice is to either do a CC or a VB.
Yeah, very valid point. Yeah, in general, you're always going to want to use probably a BCC because you don't want other students to know.
No. The initiating user stays in the two line because it will it's like a form. It's like a form field type thing, and then mail merge, and then a CC or a BCC to the instructor, so the instructor is aware of who's getting the messages. So it's also a notification for the instructor.
I see what you were saying. And from here, you can simply write your subject as you intended to. So this might be, let's say, an invitation to talk to me. And again, this is a chance to use those replace strings. So you can say, hello.
Actually, no. It's initiating user first name when you're using this, because it won't put in the first name here because it's like a form field in a mail merge. And if you click, you can initiating user first name would be typical. And you can see it right if you click on what replace strings can I use in the message. Yeah, it's initiating user first name in brackets.
Yep. Outside of intelligent agents, you can use, when you're creating content like announcements and such, you can use the first name curly braces, but in intelligent agents, you always have to keep that prefix of the initiating user.
Now, I probably would not refer back to the syllabus. In this case, I'd actually give them the links, but for simplicity, I have office hours per the syllabus. Please consider stopping in to have a chat about any issues you may be having. And once this is done and you save it, you don't have to worry about attaching files or anything like that unless that's relevant to what you're doing. And you save and close this. Now, again, I didn't turn this on, so it won't do anything. That's why it has this X next to it. But now I don't have to touch it. It will automatically review every student who submits that quiz and say, hey, you did well. That's great. Nothing has to happen. Or, hey, you didn't do so well. Let's meet and talk. You could also build a matching agent to give a congratulations to every student that performed above a certain average. So there's a lot of flexibility in this, and this is a very complex and high functioning system. Again, the links that I gave go to the Brightspace instructions. Just be aware they are a bit of a rabbit hole because as John just demonstrated, depending on where you're using stuff and how you're using stuff, different replacement strings actually can be relevant. The nice thing is that you do have a fairly decent in-help system. So again, I'm not quite sure what I should do here. I can simply click my how can I change my defaults, and it will tell me, or sorry, what special email addresses can I use? It will give me an overview of what each of the replace strings do. Same thing for what replace strings can I use in the message itself. So with that, that wraps up the discussion. Thank you very much, John, for correcting my misunderstanding. And are there any questions? Well, thank you all again for joining us early this morning. And for those of you who wish, I will see you again in another 10 minutes.
Thanks, Doug.
Thank you.